On today's show, getting kicked out of your foreclosed home is bad enough, but what about being forced out at gunpoint? We'll give you the story coming up. A photographer who was arrested by New York police during an Occupy Wall Street protest has been acquitted. So why was he charged in the first place? We have the details. And the NATO summit in Chicago has drawn thousands of protesters. We'll get an inside look into these demonstrations. I'm Jared Jakang Mayer. Each week, we bring you stories from the front lines of the Occupy Wall Street movement and give the microphone to you, the 99%. You're watching Occupy the Media. Thanks for joining us on Occupy the Media. We took a short break after Occupy May Day, but now we're back here again each Wednesday to bring you up to speed on the latest news coming out of the Occupy Wall Street movement, and of course, covering the types of stories and perspectives you'll only see on Free Speech TV. So to join the conversation, call us toll-free at 877-575-FSTV or hit us up on Facebook and Twitter. On today's show, we're talking about manners. What is the correct etiquette in the era of home foreclosures? For example, is being forced out of your home at gunpoint a tad excessive? You tell us, 877-575-FSTV. But first, let's start things off with the latest headlines. Protesters shut down a Bank of America branch in East Hampton, New York. More than a dozen activists from Occupy the East End took over the bank. An organizer said this was in retaliation for the millions of home foreclosures and the, quote, suffering it causes around the country. The group Women Occupying Wall Street met in New York City to stand up against the war on women. They organized the first Feminist General Assembly on May 17th. More than 300 women attended. At the top of the agenda, forming feminist goals for the Occupy movement. Here's a win for activists and journalists. A counterterrorism provision within the National Defense Authorization Act has been blocked by a federal judge on the grounds it could violate the First Amendment. Language within the law currently allows the U.S. military to detain anyone indefinitely without charges simply because they are suspected of supporting terrorists or associated forces. A group representing reporters and civil liberties advocates filed a lawsuit against the provision in March. Several media correspondents had to stop talking to their contacts in the Middle East for fear of violating the provision. And there's lots of news coming out of Chicago this weekend. Thousands of nurses and other protesters gathered at a downtown plaza and demanded a Robin Hood tax on banks' financial transactions. Days later, thousands of demonstrators participated in anti-NATO protests. Here's Caroline Briggs with the details.
American demonstrators tasted the militarized might of NATO Sunday as thousands of activists gathered in Chicago. Decked out riot police even outnumbered the very large crowd of protesters. Clashes with billy clubs and bare fists rained on the demonstrators. Tensions boiled over as police were eager to show off their inflated numbers and equipment. Though official numbers vary, thousands of protesters marched, but only 45 arrested and 2 police injured. Veterans for Peace took a stand not seen since Vietnam, service people throwing their medals away. 40 men and women denounced the U.S. military's aggression against innocent civilians.
From the Occupy movement here in the United States to, the kind of mass revolt that's being reflected in the Greek elections and French elections, a real sense of a sea change around the world where people have had enough of war, of atrocities, of poverty, of inequality, and are looking for something different.
For Occupy the Media, this is Caroline Briggs.
That wraps up the latest headlines from the Occupy front, but let's take a few minutes to talk about the NATO protests. Sitting here in our studio today is Marcy Miranda, Free Speech TV's news producer, and Don Rojas, FSTV executive director. Well, guys, we're back again after a short 2-week hiatus. We did our big May 1st May Day coverage here at Occupy the Media, and during our break, the big protests against the NATO summit in Chicago took place this last weekend. So Marcy, give us a rundown of what actually occurred, and we can talk a little bit about the outcomes and what it means.
Yeah, I mean, in that video piece, our reporter Caroline was saying 45 people arrested on that Sunday. It ended up being closer to 90, and it seems like only 8 Chicago police officers were injured. So considering that the numbers of people protesting varied between 4,000 to 10,000, that seems pretty low number of casualties, so to speak. And I think the amount of attention that Occupy and those protests helped bring to Chicago and bring to this NATO summit is really a victory for them. They got kind of what they wanted in that sense. That a lot more people were paying attention than they probably would have had the protests not occurred.
Right. Certainly, and there was a lot of focus on this NATO summit coming into it, a lot of organizing around this. Of course, the G8 summit got kind of separated about it and moved to Camp David, so that might have dampened things slightly. But Don, what was your take? You watched the coverage, you watched the outcome. What did you make of it?
No, I thought it was very powerful energy. I thought the crowds, although not as large as some of the organizers had expected, they were fairly large crowds, reminiscent of some of the big demonstrations back in the fall that the Occupy movement organized and led. This brought together aspects of the peace movement, the labor movement, and the Occupy movement, showing solidarity around a common cause against NATO. NATO, of course, is a military alliance, and NATO troops are currently fighting in Afghanistan, and were involved in Iraq as well. And what I thought was very powerful, the images that I saw, were these young Iraq and Afghanistan veterans throwing back their medals at the NATO generals and the NATO politicians. To me, it was a profound act of patriotism, of young people saying, look, we don't want your decorations because you sent us to kill and maim and occupy other people's countries.
And so, Marcy, before we move on real quickly, what is coming up next, if anything? Are there any big events like this around the horizon, or will we be looking at a lot more smaller actions occurring throughout the summer?
Yeah, I think initially it'll be a lot of smaller actions in each city and town, but when September and late August rolls around and the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention roll into the the media world, we're going to be seeing a lot more of these protests, because people who were organizing this NATO protest already said that they've got their eyes set on Charlotte, North Carolina, for the DNC.
Yeah, and of course NATO focused on big international issues, but some of the big issues back here in the United States, and one that Occupy has been very focused on, are foreclosures. Right. And in Atlanta, one family thought they hit rock bottom when they couldn't afford to live in their home anymore, but things quickly went from bad to worse. And so, Marcy, we're talking about an eviction, a home eviction because of a foreclosure, but one that unlike any that we've ever seen.
Yeah, this is a story of Chris Frazier, a 63-year-old woman who lost her home and then lost her job. I'm sorry.
She lives in the suburbs of Atlanta.
She lives in the suburbs of Atlanta, and like a lot of other Americans, she just got to the point where she didn't have a job and she couldn't afford to pay her mortgage, got behind, and she went out to Occupy Her Homes and Occupy Atlanta and said, "Listen, can you help me because I need help?" And what happened was essentially the sheriff's officers there in Atlanta came in and evicted her from her home at 3 a.m. in a pretty heartless way, I'd say.
And so it was almost like a massive drug bust that you'd expect. Something like 40 officers, guns pulled. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but you actually did an interview with Tim Franzen of Occupy Homes Atlanta, so let's watch that clip.
Tim, thanks so much for being with us today. Start us off by talking a little bit about Chris Frazier and how she got into the situation she's in and being evicted.
Yeah, well, Chris lived in her home in that house for 18 years, and she reached out to us, and it was just a clear case of foreclosure fraud. The Investment One Corporation didn't even have any claim to foreclose in the first place, and she had tried to modify several times. And this was just a clear case of an investment company claiming to hold a deed, but not being able to prove that to any court.
Yeah, and Atlanta is definitely one of the cities that's dealing with foreclosures, in pretty great numbers. But there's something really troubling about this one in particular, and it's the way the eviction occurred. Talk a little bit about what happened that night.
Well, at 3 a.m., 40 sheriff's officers stormed Chris's property, broke down the door, pulled guns on her, her 85-year-old mother, her daughter, and her 3-year-old grandson, and told them to act as if it was a fire drill. Grandmother wasn't allowed to get dressed. They had to get out in 5 minutes. They put the animals in the pound, and they basically treated her like a major drug dealer. And this was just totally unprecedented. And as far as we could see, that this was Sheriff Brown's attempt to crush anybody that was standing up to an illegal foreclosure.
Yeah. Now, you were among other activists who were actually camped out outside Chris's home. So you were there firsthand. Talk a little bit about what it was like for you as well to witness that.
Well, I actually was away that night and got the call at 3. And we loaded up a bus and drove up to the neighborhood. And it had been totally militarized. The whole neighborhood was blocked off. Cars were not allowed in and out, not just on her property, but her whole neighborhood. So it was really quite a spectacle. And finally, when the news media showed up, we just walked in risking arrest, and the police did make way. It really was a nightmare in her neighborhood that night.
Now, real brief, talk a little bit about what she's doing now and what the next steps are for Chris and her family.
Well, being that the case was in federal court, we just totally didn't expect this to happen. Normally, folks won't be evicted if there's an active case. So we were totally unprepared. We had to raise money to get a moving van and get her in a new place. Finally, Chris and her family are under one roof, but this is a temporary housing situation. So we're still struggling to raise money to deal with the moving costs, and we're fighting to win the house back. Yeah,
well, Tim, unfortunately, that's all the time that we've got, but thank you so much for sharing Chris's story with us.
Thanks for having us on.
That was Tim Franzen from Occupy Our Homes in Atlanta. And so, Marcy, this eviction, this home eviction, I mean, we've seen so many of them. In some communities, they're so common where the sheriff's office and maybe a few deputies come in, and it's kind of a quiet but sad affair. Some stuff gets put on the lawn, but this was 40 officers, a huge law enforcement production. Obviously, Occupy Atlanta thinks this was a huge overreaction on the part of the police department or sheriff's office.
Yeah, and I think part of the reason why maybe the sheriff's office felt inclined to go about it this way is because the Occupy Atlanta was occupying that home. They had tents out. They were sleeping outside in solidarity with the family, saying this is the home. The eviction shouldn't be happening in the first place. And they were really standing with Chris Frazier and her family and saying this is unfair, and just the way that
and you can almost see the logic by which the sheriff's office might have said, well, we need all these extra officers, we need to have this backup, we need to have our guns drawn because a few protesters in tents are going to protest, or maybe they didn't know what to expect. But Don, even giving them that a tiny benefit of the doubt because of that, what does this tell you about either this particular case or what's going on with foreclosures nationally?
No, I think the militarizing this situation is way over the top. It is overkill. It is unnecessary, and it's reminiscent of some of the raids that took place this is an African American family in an African American neighborhood back in the civil rights movement. When the Klan was very active. Yep. This is not good, and I'm glad that the Occupy Atlanta movement has shown full solidarity with this family. It's
Occupy Wall Street and its different groups around the country, and especially in Atlanta, have focused on foreclosures. And this is an area where it seems that they have had some success in terms of getting a lot of sympathy or being able to reach out to a very broad audience, because everybody is touched by foreclosures in some way, no matter your political strategy.
There are millions of families whose homes are underwater, so to speak. They can't afford to pay their mortgage all across the country, not just in Atlanta. This is a national phenomenon, the banks that take these mortgages and package them and redesign them and then sell them to each other. I mean, this is a big scam. This is a scam that takes
quickly,
place.
Marcy?
This is exactly what happened in the case of Chris Frazier. She's at the point now where she's not really sure what bank or who holds the deeds to her home. So to get back into her home, you know, is a challenge for her. She doesn't know where to begin.
Well, and I wonder, is this, as we start to see maybe more groups pushing back against these unauthorized foreclosures and doing some Occupy type protests there, if we will see law enforcement ratcheting it up in this way across the country. Okay, we're going to take a quick break. We hope you'll stay with us. When we come back, we'll find out why the homeless people of Denver may face criminal charges if they sleep outside. Also, if you have a computer, if you have a smartphone, join the debate online. Do you think it would be fair to ban homeless people from camping outside in your city? To join the conversation, post your comments online at Facebook and Twitter.
Hi, I'm Antoinette June, and this is your Occupy Update. The Occupy Denver Veteran Working Group will meet every Tuesday at 5:30 p.m. at the Denver Public Library. For more information and ways to get involved, visit occupydenver.org.